Hello and welcome to the Alive Kenya Book Club. Did you know that Haggai calls Christ the desire of all nations, and we may call him the desire of all ages, even as he is the King of ages? It is the purpose of these reviews to set forth Jesus Christ as the one in whom every longing may be satisfied.
While we shall glimpse into the life of Jesus through Ellen White's Desire of Ages, we may yet say the half has never been told. May the fullness of Christ quench all your unsated desires, and the Holy Spirit bring life to the words in this book. Chapter 22, Imprisonment and Death of John.
Chapter 22 of this book narrates the final phase of John the Baptist's life, and as the chapter mentions, it talks about how John the Baptist was imprisoned and how he died. And so, in the Palestine kingdom, after 30 years of after Herod the Great had ruled it, he decided to divide the kingdoms to his 4 sons. And so each son was a tetrarch. A tetrarch is a person or a governor that rule a quarter of the whole kingdom. And so he divided this Palestinian kingdom. One of his sons was Herod Antipas. The second part of the kingdom went to Herod Archelaus, and the other part of the kingdom went to Philip, or Herod Philip the second, and the other one went to the 4th son. And so at this particular time, Herod Antipas ruled the whole kingdom of Galilee and Samaria, which was a non-Jewish nation. And so we see that John is imprisoned by Herod Antipas after boldly denouncing his unlawful marriage with Herodias. Herodias was once the wife to Philip, who was Herod's brother. And so Herod Antipas took his brother's wife for himself, and for this John the Baptist denounced him, and this is the reason why he's taken into the prison. And so, despite of John's incarceration, John remained resolute in his faith. And so Herod, who respects John and recognizes his holiness, is also conflicted between his fear of John's moral influence and also his own weakness. When I say his own, was Herod's own weakness. And so we see here the chapter delves into telling us how Herodias' vengeful schemes turn out to be. It also tells us how Herod was in a moral dilemma, and it talks about the tragic outcome of John's martyrdom, and ultimately it also tells us about John's steadfastness in faith and his unwavering commitment to truth that serve to us as a testament to his role as the forerunner of Christ. And so these are the points that probably I got from this chapter 24. First of all, the chapter brings up clearly about John's the Baptist's integrity and his gospel fearlessness. And we see how the chapter brings how John the Baptist remaining steadfast and him becoming a fearless prophet. The chapter also talks about his unflinching in his denunciation of sin, even when it leads even to the verge where he's being imprisoned by Herod. And so John was fearless in his denunciation of sin, and we see the virtue of gospel integrity being showcased openly in his life. And you see in page 214 how the prophet writes about him that John had often counseled Herod, and the king had listened to the preacher's word, and he had admired his sincere and unselfish life. You used to see the prophet write in page 216 that John was a fearless reprover of sin, and his voice had been heard rebuking the rulers of the land. And so we see how the integrity, the gospel integrity of John and his fearlessness in this denouncing of sin come to be showcased in this chapter. The second point I got from the chapter was how in this state tracking, in this kingdom of Palestine, we remember that Herod was never a Roman, neither was he a Jewish. He was an Edomite, and so we see how in this tetrarchy, moral corruption and manipulation are brought out in reference to Herod and Herodias. And we see how the chapter portrays Herod and Herodias, who was now his wife, as figures deeply entrenched in moral corruption. Now we see how Herodias schemed to eliminate John the Baptist by exposing their illicit relationship. I said earlier that Herodias was the wife, the legal wife to Herod Philip II, and it was for this reason that John the Baptist was put into prison after exposing their illicit relationship. And so we see the prophet mention how Herod's life was threatened by the scheming of his wife and the evils of his own heart. She also writes in page 216 how Herodias was determined to accomplish her purpose, and she found in Herod the willing subject for her schemes. And so we see that this kingship, rather this rulers was solely entrenched in moral corruption and manipulation in that respect. The third thing I picked out here was Herod's battle with inner conflict of conscience and also guilt. And we see this is depicted that as a ruler, Herod was torn between his conscience, which he acknowledges John the Baptist, or rather John's righteousness, and his susceptibility to his desires and external pressure. And we see that the king actually acknowledges that John the Baptist was feared by him, and he knew that John the Baptist was a just man, a holy man, and he observed him. And when he had him, he did many things, and he had him gladly. And so we see here the king acknowledges how John the Baptist was just, how John the Baptist was holy, and he saw the integrity of John the Baptist, and this is showcase how he reports that. But also we see now the king also was torn in between the honesty of his conscience and also the guilt that he bore as a king. And we see Ellen White writes that yet Herod, with his conscience aroused and condemned, was still a weak man, yielding to his passions and the influence of others. And so we see that the conflict of the conscience and the guilt that he bore. On the other side, he acknowledged the purity and holiness in John the Baptist, and also on the other side, he was disturbed in his conscience And the Bible, the chapter tells us that he was still a weak man, and he yielded to his passions and the influence of the guest that he invited. And so he was not stable morally. The fourth thing that I retracted from here was the role of public opinion and peer pressure, more so when we make decision, rather when we are at position of influence and of authority. And we see how Herod's Antipas decision, particularly in exercise, and we see it was heavily influenced by his fear of losing face in front of his guests and maintaining his public image. And so Herod wanted to remain true to what he professed about John the Baptist, but also he wanted to maintain his public image in front of his guests. And sadly, the latter took precedent to the former. And so we see how the prophet writes in page 218 that Herod's rash promise to the daughter of Herodias, that was Salome, and the influence of those who surrounded him led to the death of John. He feared the displeasure of his guests, yet a command from king's own lips could not be set aside. And so we see that he was pushed to the wall by the guests that he invited, and this made him execute John because he wanted to maintain his public image. And now that's what our public opinion and peer pressure can push us, probably more so when we are at the position of influence and when we are rulers in any respect, or rather in any jurisdiction. We also see amidst this, the chapter brings about how John the Baptist endured martyrdom, and this was because he was righteous. Now we also see how John's Baptist righteousness is brought even in the context of being incarcerated and him being martyred. And we see is in how the chapter highlights is suffering, or rather the general suffering that often accompanies righteousness and commitment to the divine truth. We had mentioned earlier that John was resolute and he was very fearless in denouncing the sin even of the most respected rulers. And for this reason, he was cast into prison. And so the prophet writes in page 215 that through his prison bars, John had the works of Christ and he was comforted. The prophet also writes in page 219 that the faith and loyalty of John amid his suffering and death testified to the power of Christ's grace and gave evidence of his own firm adherence to the truth. And so John was only firm, rather John could only publicly rebuke sin because he was righteous. And so I pray that would that be also be said of us. The fifth, or rather sixth point that I retracted from the chapter was the position of divine purpose and comfort in suffering. And so we find here John finding comfort in his suffering and understanding that his life and his mission fulfilled a divine purpose, and he remains steadfast in his faith, even the point of death. So John had an option of denouncing his faith, but we see that he was steadfast in his faith, and this did cost him even his death. And we see how the prophet writes that to the desert prophet had been given the privilege of witnessing the opening of the heavens and hearing the voice of God, proclaiming the divinity of Jesus Christ. You should also write that John had been the herald of the coming Savior, and his mission was now accomplished. And lastly, we see the chapter bring clearly the contrast between human weakness and divine strength, as showcased in Herod Antipas and Herodias, and also in the character of John the Baptist. These two major characters in these chapters showcase a contrast in characters, and one of them show how human weakness is showcased, and the other show how divine strength as showcased here. And we see the chapter contrast Herod's moral weaknesses and susceptibility to sin with also John's divine strength and steadfastness, and it illustrates the power of God's grace in sustaining the righteous. And the reason why John the Baptist died is because God was with him and he was a righteous man. And this did cost him even his life. And we see the prophet writes how Herod was not altogether devoid of good principle, but he was weak, and he was a slave to passions. God's righteousness, or rather how yielding to God's leading, can make us stay true to our profession even amid this martyrdom and suffering.
Before I read this chapter on the death of John, I always felt somehow disappointed by his death, because as it is written, sometimes we feel that Jesus would have done something, maybe to save John or just something. But then the very last paragraph says that not Enoch who was translated to heaven, not Elijah who ascended in a chariot of fire was greater or more honored than John the Baptist, who perished alone in the dungeon. Yes, and then the very last thing it says, and of all the gifts that heaven can bestow upon men, fellowship with Christ in his sufferings is the most weighty trust and the highest honor. And so I think that settled that question, that it's not that the other people who were saved maybe were not greater than John, but it's because God bestowed on him a higher honor and a weighty trust for him to share in his sufferings and tribulation.
The life of John had been one of active labor, and the gloom and inaction of his prison life weighed heavily upon him. As week after week passed, bringing no change, despondency and doubt crept over him. His disciples did not forsake him. They were allowed to access to the prison, and they brought him tidings of the works of Jesus and told how the people were flocking to him. And so there we see how John was comforted by the ministry of Christ. My brother also writes but they questioned why, if this new teacher was the Messiah, he did nothing to effect John's release. How could he permit his faithful herald to be deprived of liberty and perhaps of life? Influence of people near can lead to hide out on God, and now this also tell us what we speak to people, the things we say to them may have an effect in their life. At some point, it felt like John the Baptist could have lost even faith, or rather the faith that he professed. But as soon as he heard about the messages of Christ, he was comforted. My brother also writes that in the page 250, paragraph 1, oh, how often those who think themselves as friends of a good man and who are eager to show their fidelity to him prove to be his most dangerous enemies. How often, instead of strengthening his faith, their word depress and dishearten. I think that's is showcased in what we explained above. Then lastly, from Daniel, that DA page 215, paragraph 1, oh, how often those who, or no, sorry, so faithfully did he fulfill his mission that as the people recall that he had taught them of Jesus, they could say all things that John spake of this man were true. Such a witness to Christ, every disciple of the Master is called upon to bear. My brother Nelson writes that in the estimation of heaven, what is it that constitutes greatness? Not that which the world account greatness, not wealth or rank or noble descent or intellectual gifts in themselves considered. If intellectual greatness, apart from any higher consideration, is worthy of honor, then our homage is due to Satan, whose intellectual power no man has ever equal. But when perverted to self-serving, the greater the greater the gift, the greater curse it becomes. It is moral worth that God values and loves. Love and purity are the attributes that He prizes most. Yeah, that was also profound. And then lastly, Nelly Manyala writes that the disciples of John the Baptist expected Jesus to do something, but he didn't, according to them. This led to doubt and unbelief in their hearts. They shared their fear with John, who also did not quite understand Christ's mission. But John did not express his doubts to his disciples. This is an important lesson. How often do we confidently express our fear and doubt to those around us? How does this do to their faith? While in doubt, share your doubts with God alone. I think let's emulate the faith and steadfastness of John, and even if it will mean that it will cost our life, yeah, let's fearlessly denounce sin. Satan was permitted to cut short the earthly life of God's messenger, but that life which is hid with Christ in God, the destroyer could not reach. Colossians 3, verse 3. He exalted that he had brought sorrow upon Christ, but he failed of conquering John. Death itself only placed him forever beyond the power of temptation. That's so powerful. That even if professing holiness and purity of the gospel will make us to lose our life, that one will be advantage to us, because death itself will place us forever beyond the power of temptation. Let us embrace the steadfastness and fearlessness of John the Baptist in denouncing sin. And at any point we may feel abandoned by any other person, let us take the comfort which is in the gospel.